welcome back. This is the first session of the Third Conclave of ABLF Talks Live, so you're all very, very welcome here. And I'm particularly delighted that I have the opportunity to engage with investor, author, and renowned economist Weijian Shan. Now, just before I introduce him to you, let me just say a few words about him. Of course, he's the group chairman and the CEO of PAG, leading Asia-focused private equity firm. And of course, prior to his role with PAG, he was a partner of the private equity firm TPG, then the co-managing partner of TPG in Asia. Previously, he was managing director of JP Morgan and an assistant professor at Wharton School in the University of Pennsylvania. But one fascinating part in his profile, and a line that definitely caught my attention and will everybody else, of course, if you don't know him, is the many years that he spent working as a laborer. Yes, a laborer in the Gobi Desert in China. He since, of course, holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MBA from the University of San Francisco, and many, many accolades, of course. He's the author of Money Games, the inside story on how American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank. And of course, his previous book was Out of the Gobi. So a big, very warm welcome to this session to Weijian Shan. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the book. And of course, we're absolutely delighted that you can share with us perhaps some insights on the future of finance and particularly private equity. So we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Asna, for that kind introduction. Great to be here.
It's an absolute delight to have you here. I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about your story. And of course, when we look at your corporate memoir, Money Games, this is your latest book. Really, we look at sometimes maybe the scrutiny and often the negative publicity that surrounds private equity sector. Talk to me about, what you have written about and how you think this will perhaps change it or how it should change it.
Private equity has become very significant, especially in the past 20 years. In fact, today, there are more companies controlled by private equity in the United States than publicly listed companies. That's how big private equity has become. There's a lot of talk about private equity, but there's very little understanding of how it works. It remains a mystery. I think my book would help resolve that mystery. Some books have been written about private equity, but to my knowledge, this is the first book that talks about a major private equity deal from very beginning to the full exit, starting from negotiation, investing, turning around the institution, and eventually selling the business to a strategic buyer. I think private equity, by and large, is a force for good, because it brings capital to those companies which need capital. But more than that, the value that private equity really adds is by improving the operation of the business, growing it, adding value. And that's the real value brought to the businesses in which private equity invests. And that's how, honestly, by and large, private equity makes money. There are other ways of making money, which may not be socially responsible, but I think those are exceptions to the rule.
Now, when we look at private equity companies, particularly in the last year, and we maybe saw a drop off in March and that, but they've been quite resilient for the last few months. And do you see a good future then? I mean, obviously, with your optimism in terms of private equity, do you think it's a good future for this sector?
In general, of course, I think private equity will continue to thrive in different market conditions. But I must say that this year, many private equity firms have been under a lot of pressure as their portfolio companies have been under pressure, especially for those ones which are more leveraged than perhaps public companies or than their peers. So I think there's also a lesson to be learned whenever you go through a crisis, that it pays to manage the company conservatively. It pays to be prepared for a major crisis so that the company can survive and continue to operate under all weather conditions.
Now, I know many people will value your opinion when we look particularly at the leading economies in Asia and really look, I suppose, at the economic climate there right now. You're based in Hong Kong at the moment, but when you look around you, what countries do you think are likely to really stage a quicker recovery, and why do you think so?
Well, it's quite obvious. If we just follow newspaper reports every day, I think this year, China will be the only OECD country to register a positive growth. If you look at the Chinese economic growth, in the first quarter of this year, GDP dropped about 6.8% year over year. So it was a huge drop, probably the first time in history since about 40 years ago. But in the second quarter, China emerged from the lockdown. The virus was brought very much under control. And today, every day, there was 0 case reported. So in the second quarter, the economy grew 3.2% over the last year. And in the third quarter, 4.9%. So China has staged a very strong recovery since the second quarter of this year. It will probably end the year with about 2 to 3% positive economic growth. The same cannot be said about any of the other major economies in the world.
So of course, all eyes continue to be on China, as they have been, in fact, for possibly the last 2 decades. But when we look at perhaps many of the challenges that have been posed, by COVID-19, really, and looking at China's commercial landscape, where do you see its ongoing position when we look at, China vis-a-vis the West?
I think the Chinese economic growth model will continue to shift. It has been driven mostly by investments. For the past 20 years, China has been investing about 45% of GDP. No other country at any time in history, at any stage in their industrialization process, has invested even close to 35% of GDP. But China has been doing 45% year after year, and that is because China uniquely has the highest savings rate in the world, about 50% of GDP. But that savings rate is not sustainable because the Chinese population will age precipitously in the next 10 to 20 years. Along with it, the investment rate will drop. So China will have to shift away from investment-driven economic growth to more private consumption-led economic growth. Private consumption in China is quite modest. It represents only about 39% of GDP, although up from 35% about 5 years ago, compared with about 68% for the United States, about 62% for the world average. So China has a long way to go to grow its private consumption. However, 10 years ago, China's retail goods market was less than half that of the United States, at about $1.8 trillion. America's number was $4 trillion 10 years ago in 2009. Last year, China's retail goods market reached $6 trillion compared with $5.5 trillion for the United States to become the largest in the world. And this year is probably going to do $6.5 trillion. And America may be holding on to $5 trillion. So China has become the largest consumer goods markets in the world. And I think the future growth will be very much driven by domestic private consumption.
Fascinating figures there. And indeed, I think this will be certainly one of the conversations I look forward to having a look back on to digest some of the great figures that you have given us there. When we look, though, at, trade talks and we look at the history of the relationship, I suppose, in the last couple of years with America and China, how do you see that developing under the new administration?
Well, of course, in the last 2 years, we have experienced trade war since about 2 years ago, followed by technology war, and to some extent, capital war or financial war. And the policies have been shifting sometimes unpredictably, as two countries were engaged in tit for tat combat in the trade war. That is unfortunate for investors because the world became very uncertain, and investors, by and large, don't like uncertainty because it means a lot of risks. I would expect the Biden administration to at least bring back some stability in the relationship, not necessarily better relationship, but more stable relationship. You see, American foreign policy has some consistency with it, let's say in the past half century, since after the war. But that consistency seemed to have broken in the past 4 years. And there's every indication that that consistency may come back, may change a little bit, but I would expect the Biden administration to work with international institutions, with other countries, to operate within the framework of international economic order that America itself had established since after the war. So that, I think, would mean stability to the market, and that should be welcomed by investors.
Without a doubt, I'm sure it will. Talk to me a little bit about, some of the challenges and perhaps opportunities that the pandemic presents when we look ahead in terms of post-COVID, particularly in terms of, I suppose, cultural globalization. What do you think?
Well, the world was very much integrated because of international travel. People can or could hop onto a plane and go anywhere in the world with a moment's notice. But that was broken by the pandemic, and I have not traveled since March, and I have got stuck here in Hong Kong. The longest time I got stuck in one place in the past 30 years because of the pandemic. But fortunately, maybe timing-wise, it's very fortunate that now we can use Zoom, as we're doing right now, and video conferencing technologies. And therefore, I have not felt that we are cut off from the rest of the world. For example, I published my new book, Money Games, back in October. Now, when I published my first book, Out of the Gobi, in January of last year, I traveled around the United States to give talks, to promote my book. And that was a way of doing that. And when you publish a book nowadays, without being able to travel, you would think your ability to promote a book is very much inhibited. But to the contrary, now I can talk with so many people at one time through video conference. So I think the globe is more integrated virtually nowadays, whereas in the past it was much more physical. I suppose even after pandemic, people have discovered that there's some other ways to connect than having to travel across international borders. And maybe our ways of conducting business or socializing with each other have permanently shifted and changed.
And I suppose the great thing about it is that we probably have the advantage of having both to choose from when things get back to whatever that, different normal is going to look like. But let's talk a little bit about your book, and particularly, I suppose, about your process as a writer and, obviously as an academic and, a senior and serious player in the world of economy and all of the great works that you've done. But really, it's only in the last few years you've sat down and you've, delivered these great books. Talk to me a little bit about it, because people also talk a lot about your honesty in terms of your approach. What's that process, and why is it so important that that's what you're writing about?
Well, the two books are different. The first book was, or is, a book about a particular period in Chinese history, and probably the most horrific part of Chinese history in its recent history, which I lived through, and many people in my generation lived through. As you mentioned, I was a hard labor in the Gobi Desert of China for many years, and I was not able to attend secondary education at all. In fact, I was out of school for about 10 years, never went to secondary school. And that was a special period of Chinese history, which we lived through. And I thought that that history is very important to remember, lest we forget. And in fact, you can't really understand China today without knowing its most recent history, as recently as probably 30, 40 years ago. So that was my motivation to write the book. And the book quickly became a bestseller to my great satisfaction. So it has done very well. In fact, Janet Yellen, who was my academic advisor at UC Berkeley, wrote a foreword for the book. So I think the audience should get the book. If you don't read the book, at least you read her foreword, which I think is extremely interesting. My second book, Money Games, is really to fill a void in the knowledge about private equity. As I said, many books have been written about private equity, but typically by outsiders and typically dealing with the deal-making part of the transaction, such as Barbarians at the Gate, which was written in 1989, 1 year after KKR acquired RJR Nabisco. So the book dealt only with the deal-making part of that particular transaction. And the book was made into an HBO movie, so it became a bestseller and very popular movie as well. But there was almost no book which deals with the entire investment cycle from beginning to the end, which my book does. So I think it's very interesting read for those who would like to understand how private equity works. And it's a fascinating story as well, with all the twists and turns, all the ups and downs in that deal process. Of course, eventually we made a lot of money out of that deal, which is an interesting part as well.
Now, I'm really looking forward to actually reading both of them. But on the first book too, and I did see that forward by Janet Yellen, of course. And when we just look back at it sometimes, I think, and when people realize what the Cultural Revolution was all about. But again, I think it also sort of maybe tested your resilience a lot, because missing out on so much of your education and just socialization, and then you caught back up in just such a remarkable way. I mean, I think we look at that word resilience, if nothing else, there was a lot more, I think, and drive and ambition that came with it. But do you think that's something that people really need when it comes to how people do business these days, and indeed how people just get through their lives?
In my experience, it is very important to study, to learn, because education really helps you get wherever you want to be. And I think that in the world we live, sometimes you come across a good opportunity. More often, you don't come across a good opportunity. And that you cannot control. But if an opportunity arises, and if you're not prepared to capture it, then you only have yourself to blame. And therefore, I think education is critically important. Continuous learning is critically important because you prepare yourself for the next opportunity. And that has been my lesson.
Now, we have a few questions from our viewers here, and a viewer from the UK talks about, given all that has changed in the world, and I suppose particularly this year and over the years, what would your best advice be to new investors and young investors perhaps looking at this market?
I think, talking from my own experience, very often investors are attracted to the possibility of making a lot of money, that is substantial upside. And from my point of view, the most important thing is not to lose money. If you can manage not to lose money over a long period of time, very often the upside will take care of itself. And therefore, risk management is probably more important than anything else. You should always ask yourself the question, what is the probability I will lose money from this particular transaction? I typically would stay away from a transaction, even though the upside can be very substantial. And for that reason, I lose some deals. If I think there is possibility, we may lose our investments, we may lose money. So We may miss some opportunities here and there because we're so disciplined, but we have managed not to lose money, and therefore we have done pretty well. I think for a new investor in particular, if you're not so experienced with the market and so knowledgeable with, let's say, private equity or investment or investing in general, focusing on the downside, managing the downside is probably the most important thing to do.
No, and very sound advice there. I think, yes, of course, people want to make money, but I love the fact you're saying, yeah, focus on not losing money is even more important. A few more questions and questions that we've had, and many of our viewers actually want to know the same too. When we look at, how can you foster better cultural understanding between countries? And, you mentioned it briefly there, I think, in terms, but how do you think you do that, especially like in the years to come?
Of course, again, we go back to reading. You have to understand the history of different countries in order to understand it. When I approach a problem, when I look at the issue, I look at any problem from two perspectives. One is historical, and the other is to compare with others. That's how you understand a particular issue. So if you understand the history, if you don't compare it with other countries, then it is very difficult to understand a particular issue, a particular problem. And that would require you to read about the history and then travel around to understand different cultures in different countries. I think that's the only way to do it.
And when we look at history, I mean, you've always said, I've heard you talk before about the fact that, people need to learn from history and make sure, it's the bad side of history, so to speak, is never repeated. When you look around the world, are you optimistic in the direction that we're going?
That's a very general question. In some places, yes. In some other places, no. And in fact, in the same place, some things are going right and some things are going wrong. That's just the reality of things. So I suppose as an individual, you applaud the good things or what you feel as good things and try to take advantage of the situation. And hopefully good things will always prevail. But we can only hope.
Yes, indeed. And even though hope is, I suppose, not a strategy, it's something that definitely, if we don't have, we're probably in more trouble. Talk to us a little bit about when you look.
In private equity, unlike public market investing, it is very difficult to hedge against macro risks. In public market investing, if there's economic crisis, first, you can hedge the risks by, let's say, shorting the market, or you can simply get out of the market by selling whatever you own. But in private equity, there's no liquidity at any given moment in time. You get stuck. So the only way to hedge or to manage macroeconomic risks is to stay away from the market. And that would require you to understand macro risks in different markets. For example, our strategy of investing in India is very different from investing in China. In China, we don't invest in the export sector, knowing that sector is under the pressure, especially given the increased labor costs year after year and currency strength. And in India, to the contrary, we focus on the export sector, outsourcing sector. So unless you understand the macroeconomic conditions of different countries, you won't be able to successfully invest in different countries.
Now, of course, as an investor, and particularly when you look at private equity, looking at maybe countries like India, you just mentioned Singapore, even here in the United Arab Emirates, do you look at the appetite for investments, that it's healthy and strong in the year to come, and indeed maybe for the longer term?
Yes. The fact is, in today's world, there's a glut of capital. There's too much capital. And there are few good investment opportunities which will give you, let's say, 20-30% IRR, high return type of investment opportunities. So you have to be very selective, and you have to be very focused on finding those opportunities. And there's always capital if there's a good deal.
Yes, indeed. I think that's something we always hear, indeed, in every sector. And also we have to look, I suppose, at the changing landscape too, and looking at the prominence of ESG and how people are paying a lot more attention to this. This is something I think that we're going to probably see a lot more of, and companies need to wake up. What do you think?
Absolutely. ESG is the focus of PAG, our own firm, but it should be the focus for all private equity investors. I think you have to be socially responsible in order to be a good force in the world, in every economy. So I think that's the trend. Every private equity or the entire industry is moving towards ESG-friendly policies. And that is very important for this world.
Now, you've always talked about being looking at market economies and the fact that perhaps government needs to pull back, and this should be happening, and it's happened in many countries. Would you like to see it happening in so many more companies and countries, the way the private investor actually has a much better opportunity, and again, to create wealth for nations?
Yes, I think the government has a role to play, which is in redistribution. Inequality has become the issue worldwide in different countries. But at the same time, I think the government should pull itself out of the market. I'm a big believer of smaller governments as opposed to be big governments on the production side of things. On the market, that's where the government should step back. But in redistribution, that's their responsibility. So for example, take China as example. It has achieved remarkable economic progress in the past 30 years. In fact, in the past 30 years, the Chinese economy has grown by 36 times, unprecedented in the world history. China has been able to do so not because of some unique China model, but because China has moved in the direction of a market economy. But China still has a long way to go. The government is still too big. The state-owned sector remains too large. So in order for China to continue to grow, the government need to move more in the direction of the market. The government need to get more out of businesses, that is to privatize the state-owned companies. And that's the only way to sustain China's economic growth, in my view.
Indeed, there's so much to be done, so much to be learned. There's so much that's going to happen, actually, as we all see in China. And I mean, from your viewpoint, of course, you see it from every aspect. So it's got to be very, very exciting and very interesting for you to be observing it and to be very much part of what's happening. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll hopefully you and I carry on this conversation, perhaps when we see you in person, if you're going to maybe join us at ABLF when we all get back to normal. But indeed, in the meantime, we'll be able to stay connected, of course, via all of these very exciting digital tools that have made this all possible. Once again, I really, really want to thank you, Shan, so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
And indeed, it's been an absolute delight to have you here with us, of course, and to really listen to that insight. Now, for many of our viewers, and for all of our viewers, of course, these are two books I certainly want to get my hands on. And what we've done also is put the link just below, the way you can make sure that you access the book there, that book, Money Games, that corporate memoir, and possibly also, keep an eye on, in May, the personal memoir too, Out of the Gobi. So I think there's lots of lessons to be learned on both, but Money Games, something that everybody will be interested in. So once again, thank you so much. That's it from this opening session, and we'll be right back. So stay with ABLF Talks. We'll be right back.